Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. This is Paul Bass inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, today we're going to look behind a book. The title of a book that's making America tick is called J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. New Haven's own Beverly Gage wrote the book, and it's terrific. It's give a whole new perspective about what's happened in our country for 70 years in the 1900s and how we got to the place we're at today. Beverly Gage, thanks so much for coming into The Independent.
It's great to be here, Paul.
I'm going to ask you if you can move your mic a little closer to you, just so you're almost touching it. I just want to tell you, everyone's just think this book is just getting raves everywhere, as well it should. I loved it. I loved every page. This is what Brian Burrow, is that his name?
Brian Burrow, yeah.
Without the S at the end. I always think he's Burroughs. He writes good books, too.
He does. Some of them are about the FBI.
Yes, and he reviewed Beverly's book in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. It said, Ms. Gage... You're still courtesy titles in some publications.
Apparently.
Yeah. Ms. Gage sweeps the myths and half-truths of Hoover's life as a museum curator might a cobwebbed antique. That's a good metaphor. Revealing not the boogeyman of left-wing fantasy, but something no less fascinating. A closeted gay man who emerged as probably the most powerful civil servant in U.S. history. This is a nuanced portrait in a league with the best of Ron Chernow and David McCullough. So Beverly Gage, what does it feel like to have all the smart people in the country say you just wrote this amazing book?
Well, it feels pretty good, but it feels good not only because obviously I'm glad that people like the book, but I worked on this for more than a decade, and there were a lot of moments in that process where I did kind of wonder if the world had a place for this kind of, as you saw, Paul, long, big, serious, I hope well-written, but big fat work of scholarship that takes a long time to research and a long time to write and a long time to read. And
I would argue the saving grace was that you had such original perspective on this material. So much of it was new. It's so important to our lives. And you were a journalist. You started out in New Haven Advocate, the old Wall Weekly where you and I worked. And I think you became a historian. You never lost the touch to write clearly and interestingly. So I think that's what the saving grace of that book was.
Well, you know that
it wasn't homework.
You're the person who taught me to do that. So
Thank you very much, Beverly. So Beverly, when people, I haven't seen anything but incredible praise for this book, as well deserved. But what's interesting about it is you're asking people to accept a new premise about J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI, created the modern FBI, and ran it for 60-something years, right?
Yeah, well, he was there at the head of the FBI for 48 years, and then he was in the Justice Department another 7 years before that.
So tell me if this is an accurate way of describing your premise. You're telling us that this matters on two levels. One level, it matters just J. Edgar Hoover's a freaking incredibly interesting and important guy. He built the FBI, he spied on everybody, he dealt with every important historical moment from the early 1900s, 1972, from the Cold War, World Wars I and II, crackdown on dissent, civil rights, all that. He created modern law enforcement, the modern surveillance state, and perhaps, I'm going to push you a little bit on this one, the modern new right. And that's our story. But you're also saying it's our story. It's not just J. Edgar Hoover's story, it's our story, which is a big claim. You did convince me of it, but it's a big claim. You're saying it's partly the story of our nation's 20th century, World War I, Palmer raised World War II, the Red Scare, the Cuban Missile Crisis, civil rights enforcement's aftermath, and also our individual stories, like see ourselves in how can society produce a J. Edgar Hoover. Is that a fair way to put the premise?
That's absolutely it. So one of the things that I wanted to do was not only to write a biography of this interesting person who, as you say, is really pretty interesting in his own right, but to use it as a way of thinking about some bigger political story. And, I think that entailed getting away from this stereotype or really caricature that we have of Hoover, which is that the things that he did by strong-arming other people, sort of sitting alone in some dark room with his files, making everyone else do it.
Or telling, like John F. Kennedy, I'm going to tell everybody who he had affairs with.
Right.
When in fact, Hoover had deeper secrets, so it's kind of a tie.
Right, exactly. So he had plenty of secrets. But, the other thing that he really had was a lot of support in Washington, in the country at large. And so that, in many ways, I think is the most surprising thing, because after his death, people kind of wrote him off as all the abuses and excesses started to come out and said, oh, he did those terrible things. It had nothing to do with the rest of us. Whereas the actual story is that he was incredibly popular. He had really widespread support.
The most popular trusted man in America, right? He topped the polls. He beat your priest. He beat your president. He beat everybody. And through some of his own finagling, he got TV shows lionizing him and his agency and the whole idea of the FBI.
Yeah, he was there for a long time as the most popular guy.
So you
in
talked
America.
about how it wasn't by bullying people as much as building a state that our society wanted, an idea I want to get back to. But also, isn't there also a story here you meticulously go step by step how when every president came in, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat, an agenda to stop what he's doing, he found a way to work the bureaucracy, how to make himself useful, how to get the new boss to need him, whether the LBJ finding out. LBJ just loved it when it turned out he could just spy on everybody. That was like really interesting part. But also FDR wanting to have like the FBI become a federal way to stop the bank robbers and people's worries about crime. And that it was sort of like so often in politics, it seems like, and in government, the truth is so much more interesting than the conspiracy. That you just show the memos. You read these memos he wrote when he didn't want to slow walk a policy they didn't want, or if he was fighting with the CIA and trying to, when they screw up something, let the president know so he could back it power. It was sort of like how bureaucrats work, right?
He was a perfect bureaucrat. I mean, that was really where his power came from. So building the FBI kind of in his own vision, and really with an iron hand. There were very, very few mechanisms of accountability on the FBI when he was there, partly by chance and partly by design. And then, he made himself useful to 8 different presidents. So he was appointed, he became head of the FBI in 1924 under Calvin Coolidge. He stayed there until 1972 under Richard Nixon. So that meant he was there for Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, who was not related to him, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. And 4 of them are Republicans, 4 of them are Democrats. And you don't survive in office for that long in that way without kind of knowing how to work the politics as well as how to run your own bureaucracy.
I mean, I think a mark of a successful book is where we can see ourselves in the story, both relating to the character. We understand when, he wanted to keep his private life out of the picture and all that kind of stuff, but also how we could put ourselves, would we have helped enable the rise of a Hoover? So it's easy for us, as you say, after he died, everyone put up their hands and said, he ran COINTELPRO, this counterintelligence program where the FBI were the biggest criminals in American democracy. They were creating fake stories about people to try to stop them from being able to protest the government or in some cases die. And what you find out reading Beverly Gage's terrific new book on her, J. Edgar Hoover, is that the liberals, as much as anybody, empowered him. He had very conservative views, very racist views, very right-wing views, but he was just as much enabled by FDR and the liberals all the way through, including Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP. And that's what resonated with me when I read the book, because I think I would have enabled the J. Edgar Hoover too. It made me think about when I cover cops and FBI people, my interactions with directors of the FBI here, police officers, and when you're a reporter, and reporters definitely enabled Hoover, you get kind of excited when you have access to inside information. You identify with the people you cover, and you kind of see the barriers they're working against, and you also believe the hype. And so I guess I had no doubt after reading your book that I'd be another one of those liberals who touted what Hoover did, even though in history you'd think you wouldn't. You think you would have been?
Well, I think in doing the research, I found myself kind of struggling with all of these moments where I found myself pretty sympathetic to what he was doing, and particularly sympathetic to the sorts of things that he was trying to project. I mean, the sort of political puzzle of the book is that he's this ideological conservative in lots of ways that probably aren't super surprising to people today. He was racist. He was an avowed anti-communist.
And I really disagree with the point in the Wall Street Journal. He said you overplayed the idea that he belonged to this fraternity Kappa Alpha, which was about birth of a nation. It was about celebrating the Confederacy and Jim Crow. But in fact, that was so central because, as you point out, he got involved in college, and his whole life he was an active member through near his death when he got awarded, and that was pretty interesting.
Oh, yeah, the Kappa Alpha material I found really interesting. They're still around, by the way. I don't know if they have a chapter at George Washington University, which was his alma mater, but they're still around as an institution. But in any case, so he has all these conservative values, but he also makes a big case for himself as a kind of icon of professionalism and of government expertise, and that the FBI men are going to be these sort of expert, perfect investigators. And that had a lot of appeal to a lot of liberals from, Franklin Roosevelt on up. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about, would you in that moment have supported and enabled him, is that a lot of his power came in moments of emergency when people were really scared. So,
and you always turn for that security, especially people in office, whether it's a reporter too. You always look for the person who kind of feels confident they can know a situation, handle a situation.
Exactly. And that's what he did. In the 30s, there's a lot of concern about violent crime. People like John Dillinger, right? Bank robbery and kidnapping. And Hoover says, I have the answers. We can do this. Same thing happens with domestic intelligence in the Second World War. And then again, when the Cold War comes along, he says, I understand the communists. I can crush them. And I'm going to do it in a way that is more responsible than someone like Joe McCarthy. And so lots of liberals loved him, supported him. The ACLU backed him sometimes, which is kind of amazing to think about.
Well, because for his own political survival, even though he kind of directed the Palmer raids, Palmer was blamed for it, and he wanted to show that he was different. I mean, that's the great nuances in your book. And the book is J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. Beverly Gage, professor of history at Yale, wrote it. It's amazing. Viking Press. I recommend it to everybody. I think you left out just now the part that not just if we were liberals or lefties then and making excuses for him. When you read your book, you find out that despite his hardcore racism and conservatism, he genuinely worked to stop lynching when he could, or to stop, even though he believed in segregation, he used the FBI, according to your book, Beverly, if I have it right, to try to stop white citizens councils and the Klan, which his chapter, Kappa Alpha, celebrated. He stopped them from committing violence. I mean, and he did seem to believe, it seemed like you concluded, Beverly, am I correct, that he wasn't just doing it because he believed in rules, which was important, and he believed in law, but that he also believed in that professionalism, that he believed that even though he had these views, he had to stop people with similar views from lynching and killing people. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And that's a feather in his cap.
Right. These were a couple of the moments that surprised me the most, and where I found myself sort of cheering him on was this campaign to investigate lynchings in the 1940s at a moment when it was actually pretty hard to do that because Congress kept refusing to pass an anti-lynching law. So getting federal jurisdiction to go in and do these big investigations was pretty difficult. And then again in the 60s, he really goes after the Klan, after neo-Nazi groups, white supremacist groups, and all of those cases, they seem to have a couple of things in common. One, as you said, was violence. Two was defiance of federal authority, right? So a lot of the white South, whether it's lynching or Klan activity, we're doing it and saying, ha ha, federal government, you can't come get us. And nothing was going to make J. Edgar Hoover madder than that kind of overt defiance of not only law and order, but federal power in particular.
I think if you lived then, you actually would have been critical of Hoover, and I wouldn't have been. Because when you and I worked at New Haven Advocate, I remember I had gotten access to some information about drug raids and stuff, and I thought that was so fun and wrote it. You were a young person there, but you said, "Why isn't our role to question the drug war rather than like celebrate the arrest?" But here's the way I think we might have played an opposite role before reading Beverly Gage's book if we lived back then, which is that we probably would have been upset about the execution of the Rosenbergs as being spies and the whole allegations about the Communist Party, the allegations against Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers. And you're not the first person to write this, but I think most definitively here with some of the recent material you got, it seems pretty clear that Hoover was right about Alger Hiss, about the role of the American Communist Party in infiltrating organizations here and working directly with Moscow, but he couldn't tell people because he didn't want to reveal the information he was getting through the Venona cables, that he would blow too much of his investigations if he went to court cases. Do you think that's true, that maybe we would have been harder on then and less hard when we look at it now?
That seems really possible. And you said this is not only a book about Hoover and the country, but about kind of individual lives.
And how we do it now, with the rise of surveillance state now that he created, how much are we enabling today? We do want the FBI to go after white supremacist groups now, right? And January 6 people, although I'm very concerned when they create the situations that tell people to get infiltrated, try to get them to commit a violent act and then arrest them for something they were never going to do.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things that's happening now that is right in your theme, and I wrote an essay about this for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, is that for the first time really since Hoover's death, if you take opinion polls, Democrats and liberals
Yeah, we
like
love
the
the
FBI
FBI.
better than Republicans and conservatives. And a lot of that just has to do with the Trump investigations. But I think there is also this sense as right-wing violence emerges, et cetera, that you've got all of these Democrats and liberals sort of urging pretty draconian action, urging infiltration, all of this.
Because the violence is coming from the right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that, but then, and this is what's so nuanced about your book, and Burrow touched on this in his Wall Street Journal review. So on the one hand, we say, hey, this racist guy went after lynchings. Great. Hey, this guy actually has some goods on the communists. But especially with the rise of COINTELPRO, as you detail in such chilling ways, if they became a rogue criminal organization, the way they went after dissent. So they went after Martin Luther King, and so he'd almost kill himself. They created documents, falsifications, so that Black Panthers would try to kill each other based on false information. That's pretty heavy stuff. And he was incredible racist about Martin Luther King, and I don't want to repeat the words here. So how do we put that together? The way Burroughs did is he said age. He said Hoover got too old and he kind of lost it. There were no more protections on him. So in his last 15 years, he just went crazy. And it was Nixon, one of his closest friends, I learned this from reading your book, who actually wanted him out, but felt he couldn't get him out. So thank God he died. That was like cynical Nixon at his best. But do you agree with Burroughs? Is that COINTELPRO was sort of maybe a logical extension of where he had begun when there are no more guardrails on it and where he just got a little dotty being old? Or is he wrong about that?
I think there's some truth to the being old in the sense that Hoover had somewhat less control over the organization as he got older, and he was a little more paranoid and was, I think, angry that the world was changing in these ways that he didn't like, and he saw himself as this force to contain it. But I also think that COINTELPRO is interesting because it's a great example of kind of how secrecy and these kinds of illegal, extra-legal, or at least very secret programs emerge, which is that he had a pretty good sense of what the country was going to tolerate and not tolerate. And when he wanted to do something and he didn't feel like he had other means available to do it, that's when the secrecy usually came in. That's when he would come up with some sort of relatively rogue program like COINTELPRO. Although I did find in a new set of documents that there is evidence that he did tell the Eisenhower administration, the Johnson administration, like, we have these disruptive counterintelligence programs, and everyone just said, fine. I mean, they didn't know the details, of course, but they didn't object either.
So Beverly Gage, how did you start getting on the story that led you to spend a decade writing this incredible book of J. Edgar Hoover? Did you start out saying I'm writing a biography of Hoover, or how did it happen?
Yeah, it was on my mind for a few years, even before I started actively working on it, because I kind of ran into Hoover as a historical character when I was writing my last book, which was a story about a bomb attack on Wall Street in 1920. Thank you. And he was there as this very young man. He was 25 years old at the time, but he was already there kind of looking into this investigation, learning how to do surveillance, learning how to fight communism, all of these things that he was going to carry on. And so that got me interested because I could see him learning, and those ideas were going to become so influential. And then also it led me into kind of reading the other biographies of him, most of which had come out in the 80s and 90s. And it seemed like there was just a lot of new material and new ways of thinking about him and his life. And nobody was in the midst of writing a big new biography. Now I know why that is. It's because it takes forever. But yeah, that's what drew me in.
And did it begin as a biography of Hoover? Did you pretty much stick with what you was going to do 10 years ago? Because a lot of times books take a pivot.
Yeah, it did begin as a biography. It actually began with these 4 main sections, which are still the 4 main sections of the book. I mean, along the way, I found all sorts of moments and incidents. And
was there a pivotal moment when you say, wow, this is shaping up to be a different person, a different project than they thought? Or like this is going to be your Robert Caro's Robert Moses or LBJ? Like, Was there a moment you said, "Oh my God, I'm all in. Oh my God, this blew my mind. I didn't expect this."
Yeah, I had a lot of those moments, and like Robert Caro, I'm glad that I was stopped from doing this. There were moments where I went to my editor and said, "This clearly has to be multiple volumes," and she said, "Do not do that because this could go on for your whole life, and you don't want that. And also, nobody wants to read only the first half." So we have one big volume.
Call.
Yeah, I think so.
With 400 something pages, it's a lot, but it's also not a lot. Especially when it's written by someone who's done journalism. I mean, you can read it.
It's supposed to be a real story,
it's real,
right?
It's a real story.
I was very insistent, maybe this comes from journalism too, on having a photograph and a caption at the beginning of every chapter, making the chapter short.
Chosen.
So,
yeah.
So people could enter.
And you always cliffhanger. Something was leading into the next chapter, right? So how did you combine your experience as a journalist and experience as a historian? For instance, were there many in-person interviews in this?
So I did not do interviews for this, in part because Hoover died in 1972. So the number of people
and
who
other
were
key players
alive who knew him well were pretty small, and he didn't have a family. And so it's not like there's generational
I wonder if that
succession.
made it better because you have such a clear eye on this stuff, and when you interview people, you get so compromised sometimes.
Right. That was part of it. And then I also think that with a figure like this, even people who knew him this far out, they kind of mostly repeat the legend rather than
and the
offer
amount of written
new
material
insight.
is not available because you had the benefit of time. Stuff's been declassified, right?
Yeah, there's an endless supply. But I tried to really hone in on the records that were new, that were important.
And tell me
hadn't
about
been
that.
seen
What was
before.
new? What hadn't been seen before?
Well, there are a bunch of records that came out after the end of the Cold War. So some of the
Venona files that Claire, the guy at Yale, had written about that. I read those books.
Right, exactly. So there was Venona. There was this other project called Solo. There were a couple of infiltrators and informers in the party. And then the most recent big kind of public document dump was that under the JFK Assassinations Act, the records of the Church Committee were finally released, and
Those were never released before the Church Committee?
They were not. I mean, we had the reports.
Well, and he had the hearings. The public,
Right.
I mean, I've read the church hearings.
Exactly.
And Frank Church was the senator who, when COINTELPRO was revealed, I guess, in the 70s, that he then held hearings revealing that stuff. So what was in the records that wasn't exposed at the time?
So what we've had were the Church Committee's reports, the hearings, and then, some of the witness testimony. But what was made public a couple of years ago are all of the research documents that they gathered that their report was based on. So, for instance, they wrote a lot about the FBI's campaign against Martin Luther King. And the documents that have been released now just have a lot more detail.
Give me an example of something was in one of them.
So there's some stuff about King's sex life.
But that was known, right?
Well, it was known, but there's a lot of new detail in here and
that's going to be
unredacted
and more. That's going to be
material.
unredacted for years. You said, yeah.
Exactly. This is how I saw the documents that showed that in fact Hoover had told people about COINTELPRO. That's in this collection. And then I filed a lot of FOIA requests
And what
myself.
did you get?
I filed mostly for two categories. One was right-wing organizations because I thought we knew so much about the FBI on the left and we didn't know very much about the FBI on the right. And then just key officials kind of in Hoover's
And what
orbit.
did you find on right wing that hadn't been known before?
Well, I guess there were two things. One was that Hoover himself had a kind of ambivalent relationship with right-wing organizations that loved him. So the far right, particularly in the 60s, thought he was this great hero, which was kind of funny because they generally hated government bureaucrats, but he was always the big exception. But Hoover was often a little more skeptical of them than they were of him. He's thought the John Birch Society was pretty nutty. And then sometimes he did, investigations of organizations on the right in the way that he did on the left. So the citizens councils in the South in the 50s, there are interesting memos where he says, well, I really want to know what's going on with them. We have to keep track of them, but we also have to acknowledge we got to keep this super quiet. People are going to freak out. They're not necessarily doing anything illegal, and this might be an infringement of their civil liberties.
You know what I love, Beverly, too? And this is great stuff. Also, and there's so much material that did exist, like the Church Committee, COINTELPRO papers. it takes an historian like you to weed through them to see what's important. Often the most interesting stuff was out there in View, but View meant 25,000 pages of stuff. Was there anything you found that had been there before that no one noticed before?
Well, the news coverage was really interesting to me because Hoover kept these scrapbooks. You know, he was very concerned about his public image. He was very sensitive to criticism, and he had this big PR apparatus. And so partly as a result of that, there are just these boxes and boxes and boxes of press clippings.
Where did you see those?
They're all at the National Archives. And so that was all obviously public material, but you have to read it kind of slowly and carefully to find these.
So you were
interesting
sitting there in
quotes.
the building with boxes?
I was sitting there in the building with boxes.
That's fun.
Yeah. That's a whole lot of what I did here.
Beverly Gage, she did what the FBI did to the rest of the country, finding out about J. Edgar Hoover, and what he really did is he built up the FBI in her new book, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century. You listen to that on WNHH, Dateline, New Haven. At 103.5 FM live stream, newhavenmin.org. And obviously, you said you didn't want to write a 20,000-page book, which you could have, because you felt no one would read it. And I was obviously interested in how you made choices of what to leave out. And obviously, everybody has their own stuff that they're interested in. So I've always been most interested in Robert F. Williams, who was sort of like, before Malcolm X, the person who was seen as the anti-Martin Luther King, and who actually was written out of history. He was probably the second most important civil rights leader, I'd say, in the early 60s, late 50s, led the Monroe, North Carolina NAACP, had a best-selling book, Negroes with Guns, a debate king. And it would seem to me the kind of person who would freak out J. Edgar Hoover most. He was on the most wanted list that Hoover had, and he outsmarted Hoover maybe better than anyone in history. So Hoover wanted him caught, maybe dead. He slipped out of the country when they were framing him, and he made it with the help of the Socialist Workers' Party, who was being spied on by Hoover. He makes it to Canada, goes into a bathroom. Fidel Castro sends someone in a little plane. They go into the bathroom. Williams comes out and goes in the plane. And then he sticks his finger in Hoover's eye for years. He broadcast Radio Free Dixie through half of America from Cuba, a jazz and politics show. And then, this is the part that really gets me, and I really wondered what Hoover thought. So then Williams becomes disenchanted Cuba for being racist, goes to China, becomes friends with Mao Zedong, which was a very closed society then, sees it firsthand, and Richard Nixon, as president, decides he wants to have détente with China, and the only person who really knows what's going on in China is Robert F. Williams. So he arranges to bring him back, drop the charges. All of Hoover's base is so mad at the country and the FBI for letting Williams to fly back, and he gets his charges dropped, and he hangs out with the president. What did Hoover think about all that?
Yeah, well, I think you've given a great description. I mean, Hoover was, enraged by Robert F. Williams early on, and I actually don't know as much about his views about the whole thing by the time we get to the
well, here he had
end of the
demonized
story.
King, and then he was like the devil's answer to the king for someone like Hoover, because he's saying, don't go shoot people, but be armed and ready. Don't turn the other cheek. And he had such a following.
Right. And he embodied, I would say, three things that Hoover really despised. So first of all, he was black. And it's clear that over Hoover's career, the people who bore the brunt of not only surveillance, but disruption and harassment in the most serious ways were usually black activists. Two, he was a radical, right? And so he was sort of in not only the general left, but the pretty far left, serious socialist communist orbit, right? Is talking with people like Fidel Castro, was ending up in Cuba for a while. So that's piece two. And then piece three is that Hoover would have seen him as a vigilante, right? And one of the though that's not really what Williams was arguing, but one of the things that Hoover was often the most concerned about, sometimes from the right, often from the left, was the use of violence that was not government violence. And so all three of those things, I mean...
Plus, he was funny. The guy's a great writer, and he was funny.
Right, he was charismatic, he was effective, all of that stuff.
So what did Hoover think when the right did not want Williams brought back to America, and Hoover's FBI arranged the flights? What did Hoover think about that?
You know, I don't know. I actually didn't look at those files.
I wonder if
in
that's
enough
another
detail.
case where Hoover, even though he'd gone kind of batty by then, I wonder if Hoover did carry out his bureaucratic mission for something he hated.
Well, he often did that. I mean, particularly for Johnson and for Nixon. You know, by the time we get to the Nixon years, he and Nixon are sometimes in conflict with each other. But in a lot of cases, he viewed himself as, you know, a servant of the president.
And in his last years before he died, His closest friend, probably in Congress, was Nixon. Nixon's now the president, right? They vacationed together. Nixon was seeking to undo one of the largest enterprises of Hoover's life. He was wanting détente with the communists in both the Soviet Union and China. He and Kissinger were laying the groundwork and they carried it out. What did Hoover think about all that? Did he try to undercut it?
Well, Hoover was never super interested in foreign relations per se. I mean, he was very interested in the struggle against communism, but he really understood his bailiwick to be domestic communism.
So did he not get in, like the way he fought with Bobby Kennedy was AG over certain policies. Did he not have bureaucratic fights with Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, over warming relations with communists?
I didn't see much evidence of that.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, because he didn't tend to weigh in on kind of foreign relations matters. So he did have conflicts with Kissinger. You know, Kissinger came to him in 1969 and asked the FBI to put wiretaps on members of the White House staff, national security staff, and several members of the press, which Hoover did at his behest as they were trying to figure out these leaks of war information in particular. And then, even then, Hoover suggested pretty quickly that this wasn't a very good idea, and that if it was found out that you were actually wiretapping members of the press, there might be a big backlash.
So another case in your book was so fascinating where Hoover was the voice of reason.
Exactly.
Behind the scenes. And the other outtake I was running back, and it wasn't important enough, obviously, to be in your book, was New Haven's COINTELPRO moment when Alex Rackley, the Black Panther, was falsely accused of being an informer. It was taken to a basement in New Haven in a chapter where half the people were informers, but he wasn't. They tortured him 3 days lying in his bed in his own way, pots of boiling water over his head, and they shot and killed him. And then we had a big national trial about that. Where was Hoover on all that?
So Hoover was really interested in the New Haven story. And in fact, he gets into some conflict with a couple of his most important officials because he felt weren't paying enough attention to New Haven. New Haven was going to be where it was at in the moment of the Bobby Seale trial. And the other thing that's really interesting to me about that story, which you've written about so effectively and movingly, is this. It's a great example of what even the suspicion as well as the reality of informants
and
does.
that's why the FBI did that. They would write memos saying so-and-so's informant. So that's what I wanted to ask you about. I actually really respect how you thought about this stuff deeply, much more deeply than I'm capable to think about it, to be honest. And I had this one fight about one COINTELPRO memo. So in San Francisco, there was a discussion under William Sullivan and COINTELPRO about whether to write a memo accusing one Panther of being a government informant to another one. And they wrote, don't do that because of what happened in New Haven.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, given that there are so many examples in New Haven of them writing false letters about other Panthers, but Rackley wasn't from New Haven, so we don't have any documents that say the person we had in there leading the interrogation was our guy, which a lot of people think was true. So the question was, and David Horowitz wrote a piece attacking me for saying that memo showed that the FBI might very well have planted the idea that this guy was an informant, which you're right. In the end, doesn't really matter. They did about so many people. They just made him crazy and paranoid. I was coming off a case in New York where half the people were accused of this and there was death. But he said that actually shows they had restraint, which kind of gets to the other theme of your book, that they said, look, this got out of hand in New Haven. Let's not do it anymore. But look at Chicago. So they did keep doing it. So how do you read that memo, Beverly?
Yeah, well, I think they weren't always consistent on these questions. And one of the things that was really fascinating to me in looking at their internal conversations about things like COINTELPRO, informers, infiltration, is first of all, that they made different decisions in different situations, different field offices. You know, Hoover himself wasn't always super consistent, but also was how smart they generally were about the things that were going to disrupt social movements, right? And some of the most interesting memos to me were the ones where they said, hey, let's go ahead and do this. Let's try to, sow a division between this leader and that leader. And while the FBI is thinking about this and contemplating whether or not to do it, it happens anyway, right? Because a lot of what they're doing is trying to kind of enhance things that are otherwise happening. And when you look at their Panther memos, right, at a certain point, they say, okay, actually, we've done enough. Because this is self-perpetuating now, right? They're taking it, the factionalism, the violence,
Did you ever see the
the
one with the
mutual
glossary
suspicion.
in New Haven, where they actually showed what phrases to write to sound black? Like
Oh,
my
yeah,
man, dig
yeah,
the
yeah.
threads and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Pretty
well,
deep.
looking at their attempts to imitate either
Yeah.
student activists or black activists during this period are quite stunning. Some of my favorite stuff was that they apparently had a cartoonist on staff at the FBI to do cartoons making fun of the Panthers and of student activists.
Wow.
And so in all those COINTEL profiles, you can see these fake cartoons that ended up in the press. But there was some guy at the FBI who
They were
was
Emory Douglas.
making cartoons.
So one other theory I want to run by you again, because again, when we were talking about the great new information you found, but also your just ability to look at the endless amount of material that's not out there and help us understand it, which I think is a role of a historian. I had a theory after reading all this that I've had for a while, that if you look at the fight between the Communist Party and the federal government, the FBI, and then the Black Panthers, the kind of drag out where J. Edgar Hoover said the Black Panthers are the single greatest threat to the domestic security of the United States. My theory was that only about 4 people believed that, but they happened to be J. Edgar Hoover and Sullivan on the FBI side, and Bobby Seale and a couple of Eldridge Cleaver on the Panther side. And that, in fact, the Panthers never had any danger to overthrow the U.S. There wasn't going to be armed revolution. But because the FBI believed that, it heightened the tension so much and led to so much deadly and corrosive behavior. And that there was much more of a Cold War going on with nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union. But even then, the CPUSA, Communist Party USA, might not have been as big a threat. Even though Hoover did have some real information in that case of things they did wrong, it really wasn't going to take over America in the land of Damien Runyon. But that because he believed it did, and because the communists believe, but the Panthers too really believed that they were about to be America's version of the dozens of liberation struggles in the West and bring a communist revolution. Do you think it's only those 2 groups really believed it, but because they were in such important roles that changed American history?
Yeah, I think that that's basically true, and you're right that it's funny. I mean, particularly with the communists from very early on. Hoover is saying there's going to be a revolution, and the communists are saying that's right, there's going to be a revolution, and everybody else is sort of saying, really, is there going to be a revolution? But I think what Hoover was really key about, and this is true of the Panthers, but especially the Communist Party, is that you can imagine a different FBI head in that moment, kind of taking a very national security approach, doing espionage investigations, maybe looking at Soviet money coming into the party, and stopping it there. Whereas Hoover really took the lead in making this, the great existential struggle of his age.
If you could have interviewed Hoover, what would you have asked him?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I think I would have been a little afraid of him like everyone else.
Really? I'm not afraid of him after reading the book because
Yeah.
he's so human.
Yeah, well, he also, it's true that when people came in to speak with him, he usually just started talking and you couldn't shut him up. And he said what he wanted to say and he didn't say a word more. And then he sent
So
you
as
out
your
the
answer,
door.
what would you have asked him? I wouldn't have had a chance to ask him. I just listened.
Probably.
If you could have asked the question.
If I could have asked a question, let's see. I guess I would have asked him about his father, which I never got much of a sense of. His father was
That
mentally
was your
ill.
rosebud,
Yeah,
that he was
yeah.
affected by the weakness of his father having
Yeah.
mental illness, which you got a little bit into psychoanalysis there.
A little bit.
All right. Well, Beverly Gage, job well done.
Thanks,
We're all
Paul.
so proud of you in New Haven, your fantastic new book, J. Edgar Hoover, The Making of the American Century. It's been declared by everyone, Dashley, is a fantastic, important book we should all read, and it's true. So thanks for joining us, Beverly. Thanks for Nora filling in for Harry on the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It'd Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.
tell you now, I said at times they're getting tough. All the people taking out to the streets. They ain't no park up in the pan, and no shoes upon their feet. Oh, getting by ain't easy in these troubled economic times. If you still falling.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Pete Mazzetti Show. I'm Pete Mazzetti. My guest this evening is Sandy Clark, who is with the Old Saybrook Torchlight Committee. Sandy, welcome. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
We do this every year, so
Yep.
welcome again.
Yeah, thank you. Good
Can't
to be
believe
here.
it's been a whole year since you and I sat down
Yes,
and
it
talked
has.
about the Torchlight Parade.
Yeah.
So can you maybe tell us a little bit about the Old Saybrook Torchlight Parade? I understand this is the 52nd year?
Yes, it is.
Excellent.
Yep. So originally, we started with the Colonial Saybrook Fifes and Drums.
Okay.
And as a marching unit, we used to do a lot of parades around the state and out of state. We would do parades. And then Bill Reed is the one that kind of came up with the idea of having a Christmas parade.
Okay.
There isn't anyone like it in New England at all. And so we decided to just have it in December. And that started in 1970, if it's the 52nd year. I think my
Right.
math is right. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So we've been doing it every year since. And we've got, you know, now it's really blown into floats and other marching units besides fife and drums. But it did start out with just fifes and drum chorus and some militia units and some pipes and drums as well.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Now, how did you guys handle the couple of years during COVID? Obviously,
Well,
no parade, or how?
No, so we didn't have it in 20.
Okay.
21, Kenny and Chris Reed, the grandsons of Bill Reed, actually got Essex Sailing Masters together, and they just did a little march, just kind of in honor of his grandfather.
Oh,
and they
cool.
marched it down because that really would have been like the 50th or, you know, something
Right.
really important. And Bill Reed had passed away like
Okay.
the year before, and so they wanted to do something, so we did that. Otherwise, we did not have the parade. Yeah.
Now,
full parade.
Yeah. Now, as far as the parade goes, now it's always the second Saturday in December.
Yes,
correct?
yeah, that makes it easy for people to remember. So if they're ever, you know, trying to figure out when it's going to be,
When it
it's
is.
always the second Saturday, always at 6 o'clock at night,
Yeah.
and usually and always the same route.
And what is the route?
The route is the Fife and Drum Course start at the corner of Coulter Street and Main Street, right
Yep.
by Liberty Bank.
Yeah.
And that's where like the Cub Scouts, the Girl Scouts, and we have some dance schools coming.
Okay.
And some other groups are coming to just march with no music.
All right.
And then the floats we asked to march, to line up along the road by the monkey farm going down to the train station.
Sure.
And whatever order they happen to be there in is the order they go in the parade.
Gotcha.
And they usually go after the musical units because some of those have pretty loud music and it
Right.
drowns out the fifes and drums. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the parade route starts from the road where the monkey farm is, and it goes all the way up Main Street?
It actually starts right, we'll start with the fife and drum corps right out of Coulter Street.
Oh, okay. Yep,
That
by
will be
Liberty Bank.
first, and then
Gotcha.
the floats will follow behind.
Gotcha. And then you guys go all the way up Main Street into where's the reviewing stand?
It's on the right-hand side as you're heading towards the firehouse.
Okay.
And down towards like St. John's Church.
Yep, sure.
Down there. And then the floats continue straight, and the drum corps kind of come in, turn in towards where the Kate is.
Okay.
And then it ends there. Yeah. Yep.
And obviously, we're hoping for nice weather on Saturday.
Yes, we've had all kinds of weather, as
Uh-huh.
you can figure out. We've had everything from warm weather to snowy weather to windy and rain and sleet. We've had the whole gamut. So, yep, looking forward to a good Saturday.
Absolutely. Now, does the Torchlight Parade go off weather permitting or in every type of weather?
Every type of weather.
Okay.
It may be a smaller parade,
Right.
but yeah, any kind of weather. We have canceled it once for a full-out blizzard, and that was it. Yeah.
Oh, that had to be a hard call to
It
make.
was very hard.
That
It
had
was
to be a hard call to
hard
make.
to make. We didn't want to do it, but you know we weren't going to have any drum corps there anyway. So
No.
and the floats, it's too dangerous.
Exactly.
You know, so.
So from what I understand, there's also drum corps from Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont that come down?
Yep.
Really?
Yep. We usually have one from Pennsylvania, a big corps, but they can't make it this year.
Okay.
But we usually have quite a few corps. I think we've got about 26 lined up. You know, and we have some militia units in there too.
Okay.
And we also have the Governor's Foot Guard come.
Ah.
And they've come every year, again, wearing their uniforms, weather permitting.
Yep.
And sometimes there's only a few of them, but hopefully the weather will be nice and they will be there in full uniform.
Absolutely,
yep.
absolutely.
Yep.
And as far as so there's always a lot of floats, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And there are floats that I don't even know about. You know, usually I do ask people to register so that we get a sense of, you know, how long the parade might
Yeah,
be
who's
and how many.
coming
Yeah,
and-
you're right. And so there's usually a few surprises.
I
But
was going to say, I'm sure there's a few that
yeah.
just show up the day of the.
Oh, yeah.
They watch the weather, and if the weather's going
Yeah.
to be great, they make a last-minute call to show up. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it's like, no, we're not coming.
Right. And that's okay. We don't mind. You know, we'll take all the floats because they really do dress up their floats really nicely. And I think they're in competition with each other anyways. You
Oh,
know,
you
they
think
see what
so?
each other does every year and they really try to outdo themselves. So, no, it's really good.
What types of floats have you seen over the years?
Oh gosh, you know, we've got the fire engines that are all decorated.
Yeah.
M&J Bus puts in this wonderful decorated bus every year, and Connecticut Water Company, I'm not really sure what they do, but it's always big.
Okay.
We have some Army vehicles coming. The marinas usually do a boat of some kind on a trailer. And then we've got the other participants who just have a flatbed, you know, trailer
Yep.
with some sort of a theme on it with Christmas going on. And so you can see just about anything. Yep.
And obviously, people are very supportive of the parade.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I would love to try to figure out how many people actually come, but they are like 10 deep.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you've been there,
Oh,
10
true.
deep
Oh, yeah.
on either side of the road, and it's hard to even get a spot to see.
Absolutely.
So, no, it's really great.
So obviously, if you're looking for a good spot along the parade route, get there early.
Yes, yeah. If you want to find a place to park on the route, yes. And park on the side, the east side, no, I'm sorry, the west side of the
Okay.
road. That's the side it goes down.
Okay. And if people want a good spot, good parking spot, and good vantage point of the parade, how early do you think they should get there?
Oh, gosh. You know, the merchants along Main Street,
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
they all have their own activities that go on. You know, some
the
maybe
merchants
do
have
hot.
activities too?
I think what they do
Some of
is
them?
they might offer like hot chocolate
Ah,
or
okay.
different things outside of their restaurants
okay.
and things. So, I mean, it's great because it brings a lot of people to the town.
Absolutely. And you want to go support your local business.
Yeah.
You never know, they might
Yeah.
have staying up dinner at one point.
Right,
and then-
exactly. And I think that's what a lot of people do. They come, they park, they find a place to have dinner. Some people will just bring a bag dinner with them
Right.
and just sit there and eat it and wait for the parade. But so people do all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Start to finish, how long is the parade?
I would say it's over an hour,
Okay.
maybe hour to an hour and a half. It really depends upon how many units show up. You know, it's hard to tell.
And you probably won't know how many units are going to show up probably till like Saturday morning.
I won't know until they get there.
Oh,
you know.
oh, it's one of
I
those-
mean,
it's one of
have-
those.
I have confirmations
Right.
on the Fife and Drum Corps. Those I have, and I have a lot of confirmations on the floats
Okay.
and the other marching units, like the Cub Scouts, Girl
Yep.
Scouts, and whatnot. But like I said, there's people that show up that I don't even know about. And then there's drum corps that, I forgot to send my registration in, but they've been doing it for so many years.
Right.
They just come, which is fine.
They
We're
just,
good.
They just,
We're good
they
with
just
that.
show up.
Yeah.
Any Fife and Drum Corps you can tell us about off the top of your head that you know are coming?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
You know, Westbrook Drum Corps, the
Yep.
Junior Colonials are coming, both Deep River Corps are coming, Higginham, Haddam, Colchester, Marlborough. We've got Pete's Pirates are coming. We've got Taggart Pipes and Drums coming. We've got, oh gosh, it's called a unit called Black River. They're from the Vermont area.
Yep.
And, so a bunch of others. Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Now, if people want more information, I understand there's an email address that they
Yes.
can email to.
Yep.
What is it?
It is Old Saybrook
Yeah.
Torchlight Parade at gmail.com.
Okay.
And we also have a website, which
Right.
is new this year.
I was on it this morning. Nice
Oh,
job.
great.
Nice
great.
job.
Well, my son did that. And he did a good job.